Welcome to Boss Builds, where we here at Dungeon Mancers take ordinary monsters and make them extraordinary. Today, we talk about water elementals. My great Mick Daggers, looking
Hello.
fabulous as always.
Thank you.
What?
Yes, I'm so glad to be here.
I believe that you're the perfect person to talk to about this particular enemy, because from
Oh,
what I
you are too
understand, you
kind.
have quite a understanding or a gauge when it comes to water and water elementals.
Oh yes. Well, I'm a big fan of water, and most recently I've had some fairly fun adventures with water-going folk, and water elementals are a perfect literal representation of water becoming manifest, water becoming animated. And so, yeah, I think they're a fantastic adversary. Many adventurers get to the point where they use them as allies in combat, but facing them, it poses a great challenge, and being able to amplify that and create kind of a boss, as it were, out of water elementals. I'm really looking forward to this discussion.
I agree. I think that they, they tend to be used mostly by things like druids or your wizards that like to summon them during battle, and
Mm,
they kind of get ignored as their own entity that they are, or as fodder for your big bad spellcasting
mm.
guy who's summoning water elementals, or perhaps you're in a planar campaign and there are portals into some of these extra planar areas that these water elementals and other elementals are, finding their way into the material plane.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yes, there are so many situations where they can be implemented by the players themselves, or by our wonderful dungeon crafters, because they are, as I said before, a physical manifestation of the element of water. And we're in this world of Dungeons and Dragons, you are commonly surrounded by water, even if you're not in a seafaring or an ocean-going campaign setting. Oftentimes you're going to come across a lake or a river or some kind of canal that's running through the city center. There's so many situations where water elementals fit just perfectly.
Yeah. So there's always water somewhere that these guys can be utilized. Whether you're in a sewer, you're out on the ocean, you're on a lake, you're next to a river, they can literally crop up anywhere and everywhere, which makes them such a versatile enemy to be included. Just to spice up your life, if you've been traveling for a long time and they're crossing over a nice bridge across a rapid, and you just feel like introducing a little spice into their life, throw a water elemental there.
Yes, and that's one of the best things about water elementals, is that when you face them, you can be very plain about presenting water elementals. Oh, they rise up out of the water, and your adventurers get wide-eyed and they see this oncoming figure. But just as you mentioned, when they're crossing a bridge and it's almost dusk and it's hard to see, and you hear the rushing of the water, and suddenly something sweeps your feet from under you and you're plunged into this river. It can be very much a surprise for adventurers. And water elementals, they have a fluid kind of form, and so that's a perfect way to have a surprise for your adventures and really get the jump on them. So that's one of the things I love about water elementals the most.
Yeah, the surprise element is amazing because they can be trapped under some ice. You're in a frozen tundra and your players accidentally step on a loose piece of ice, and not only are they in freezing water, but there's also a water elemental there waiting to jump on them. So using that little surprise element is to a water elemental's advantage. But
so Yeah, go ahead,
Unfortunately,
please.
yeah, a water elemental's standard stat block is, in my opinion, kind of boring. They have the same sort
Mm,
of elemental attack. They all do slam attacks, which is fine, but a little one note. One thing I do enjoy that they included is the whelm attack. The
mm,
thought that you can get, enveloped in this water and you begin to drown a
mm,
little bit is a nice spice, and I really, really do love the whelm attack. As far as the elementals go, I think the water elemental gets the best treatment in its little special attack with the whelm. So
mm,
that is a nice little plus to the otherwise pretty boring elemental stat blocks. And a little bit of like the freeze, it's interesting being able to cause a movement debuff on a water elemental by using ice damage, which is
mm,
neglected a lot of the time. People do sleep on dealing cold damage, which the
mm.
ice element or the water elemental likes to shine a little bit of a light on, give a nice little boon to somebody who does happen to use it. But how can we take some of these abilities and really ramp them up and make it a true boss fight?
Well, something that we talked about just a little bit um, is you can take the form of the water elemental, and you can use that to your advantage. And something that before this discussion, you talked about you can trap uh, casters or adversaries from a distance. Um, y- some people might have, maybe if you're fans of uh, anime, there's actually something from Naruto that is similar to this idea. It's a kind of water prison type of deal, and you had talked about something that was so pertinent to the water elemental is that really, unless you're engaged within melee, it's hard to experience the water elemental, and for you as a dungeon crafter, it's hard to use the elemental against opponents, especially when you've got that water elemental kind of boxed in by your heavy hitters. So using this cage, which I'd love you to discuss more about, you can actually engage other players from a distance and really put them on their toes, because there's nothing more fun than throwing a caster off of their game, because, well, yeah, it's if you're out here just throwing fireballs and having a grand old time, well, that's not so fun for me as your adversary.
No, as a good way that we were thinking something, because I really, really do enjoy this whelm ability, and I just think that needs to be bumped up to a little bit of an 11, and being able to perhaps use a legendary action or a lair action to create these watery spheres to entrap your ranged characters. Because most parties are consisting of 4 to 5 people. Maybe you have 1 or 2 who are melee, so they're going to be involved in that whelm ability already. But your archers and your casters, let's get them in the fun and allow a watery sphere to kind of envelop them and capture them into there. And you can use this exact same stats as the standard whelm utilizes. I would say take away that recharge and just let it be a thing he can use either as a normal action, a lair action, or a legendary action to get them in that watery fun and begin to drown them a little bit and break their tactic.
Very much so, and that goes into a good tactic. Something that we'd like to talk about as dungeon mancers is using your environment to your advantage, because it's so easy to fall into the humdrum of you're on just a flat surface and you're duking it out, and your caster runs behind a pillar and starts pinging off shots from afar, and that gets a little boring. But if you can use that especially if, let's say that they're caught in this whelm, this distanced whelm spell, and you're able to move them, maybe that's part of your legendary action. If they're captured, they're not able to escape. You can use 2 out of your 3 legendary actions to move them in 3 dimensions, and something like that. Yeah, and being able to turn it into like a 3D fight. That's
Yes.
something that's so it's passed by when it comes to creators, is that you want to think in 3 dimensions because you want to create a space for your players to be inventive.
Hmm.
And they can only be inventive if they themselves do it, which is great, and there's some players who are really excellent at that, but you have to provide the challenge for them, and that's really going to spark that
Oh yeah.
interesting kind of scenario for them.
Yeah. You're a ranger with your longbow, and all of a sudden you're enveloped in a bunch of water and lifted 20 feet in the air, and you're struggling to get out of the water. You're having to make, you know, maybe you're making Constitution saves. This is something that I think the drowning effect should also be a little bit more challenging, but we can discuss that in just a second. Um,
Mm.
but yeah, being an archer and then being lifted in the air in this sphere of water, and your two melee combatants are whelmed inside of the elemental himself, and he's casting these bubbles around. Even make it a little bit easier for your party to aid each other. Maybe these water bubbles have to be tethered by a line of water, that if they break the tether by cutting it or shooting an arrow at it or blasting a spell at it, that'll dissipate the water, so they don't. It gives them an opportunity to they themselves escape the bubble, but also one
Mm.
of your friends can help you escape the bubble if they choose to.
Absolutely, I think that's a fantastic mechanic, and like I said, it breaks up the humdrum. I think being able to distract your players from like their main focus of destroying the boss,
Mm-hmm.
and adding more fight mechanics.
Yeah.
I mean, just being able to take your fighter or your barbarian out of that melee engagement and say, hey, you've broken your realm, and now you have to go save the sorcerer who's
Mm-hmm.
struggling to breathe at this point. Yeah, I think that's a great way to add narrative and tactical dimension to your fight as well.
Oh yeah. But yeah, I mean, part of that, the drowning thing. Normal drowning rules per the DMG are based on if you are taking a dive into normal water. I don't
Mm.
think that being suffocated and whelmed by a water elemental is necessarily the same thing, in my opinion. To me, you shouldn't be able to hold your breath for 2-3 minutes if you're being berated by a literal tsunami of a creature.
Mm.
To me, like make it like a Constitution save or something like that at the start or the end of their turn, and if they fail, that's a minute of their normal time knocked off, and then if they get to 0 minutes, they're drowning and they are at 0 HP, and they begin those death saving throws, which can be quite deadly. But if you have a high level
Yes.
party who are dealing with things like this already, this is the kind of challenge that you need to provide them.
Yes, very much so. When you have a high level individual who's got uh, triple digit HP and that kind of thing, well, the one mechanic that they really can't fight with gear or with HP is something like drowning. If they have run out of oxygen, they are not going to be able to survive it despite their 21 AC or what have you.
Exactly.
So yeah, I think that's a great way to level the playing field, and you can't just gear your way through a fight. So yeah, I think that's a fantastic idea. Something else that I thought would be a great addition to the mechanics of a regular water elemental is perhaps boosting their own defenses, as it were,
Absolutely.
using the form manipulation. Something like maybe with one of their legendary actions, they can cast something like an ice shield spell,
Yeah.
so that have the same kind of effect as the shield spell, add AC for one turn, and that's just a legendary action they can use as a reaction.
Mhm.
I think that would be something that's very cool, and when you've got a big witch bolt coming at it or something, it can be very frustrating for the player and very fun for the DM. Like, nope, I don't think I'll absorb that today. I think you're gonna have to try something else.
Yes.
So I think that would be fun.
I think that'd be actually very interesting, if he's coming up out of the water and battle starts, and all of a sudden he just forms an ice shield above, like right in front of him, and all the attacks are now, he has a +5 to his AC all of a sudden, which,
Yeah.
His standard armor class probably should be a little bit higher. And if your party is a higher level, they're probably going to have a +8-ish to hit, likely, probably more, depending on how high of level you are.
Right.
At least make it a challenge. Make it closer to a 50-50 shot that they might miss their attack if they're not using flanking or being smart about where they're positioning themselves and what they're attacking with. A 14 armor class, just frankly, is going to be way too easy for anyone above 5th level.
It's too little, and equally you're going to have to boost their HP pool as well. HP pool. But yeah, so that should be taken in consideration. Have a consistent AC boost, an HP boost, and then giving them a way to not just soak damage, because elementals are kind of known for just soaking damage when you use them as a player. Yeah, and being able to have them actually naturally negate damage from high level players, I think is important. Because when let's say you've got like a paladin and a barbarian, and then off to the side you've got a bard and a sorcerer, and they're laying down huge, heavy hitting spells, you can get in the triple digits in a single round very quickly.
Very easily.
Yeah. So,
especially if they have magic items on them.
It gets ridiculous, and so you can't just compensate with a huge HP pool, because that becomes kind of arbitrary after a while when you get in with players who are in the double digits of levels. So yeah, it's definitely something you have to consider as far as making the water elemental not just a damage soaking tank, but making it a more tactically challenging boss.
Absolutely.
And just one last note too is, I'm sorry I keep going back to this, but the shield kind of thing, when you have something that has kind of an amorphous form, you can get really narrative with the way you describe its shield. So you can do the shield wall, you can make it pop out a physical shield from its arm. You can do all sorts. You can describe this situation, and I think that should be the boon for the dungeon master, is that you get to tell a story, not just roll dice. Rolling dice is fun, we all love it, but it's those little moments in combat that make the fight something that's memorable for players and for the DM as well. So I think the water elemental is great for that, because it can make many different forms. You can think something like a Green Lantern ring. It has that kind of whatever you can think of, it can create that form, and you just use the mechanics to bring that narrative to life. So
I like the idea that they I don't know why this popped into my brain, but he uses a shield spell, and this ice leeches onto his arms, and then after the after effect of his shield spell, he's then able to morph that ice into like Pacific Rim when they pull the sword out of its arm, and he just forms that what was a shield into, now instead of a slam attack, it's an ice sword attack.
Yeah, and that's another thing too, is because it is an amorphous form, you can change the damage type. Super cool. I like that a lot. I didn't even think about that, but yeah, that's beautiful. Yeah. So let's talk about making the water elemental a little bit tougher, making it. We've kind of focused on this idea of making it more interesting, but how do you engage the players a little bit more?
I mean, a good way to break up a typical battle that your players are used to. Usually they're probably used to like an ambush, and they deal with it and they get to choose their position. Take that choice away from them, though, in a water elemental. kind of fight, you're probably fighting on a dock or a beach or maybe a boat. You're near water. Let this thing use like a tsunami attack that can take the players who are, they're on their beach, they're 30 feet off the shoreline, they're taking pop shots at this water elemental, and all of a sudden a massive wave comes slamming into them and riptides them off of the land into the water. And if your party's not prepared for that with rings of water walking or potions of water breathing, and they're ripped from their positions and now they're in a 3D swimming environment where their attacks probably are at disadvantage if they don't have those specific water-based weapons, you immediately take their standard tactics that they have been so accustomed to using, and you flipped it completely.
Absolutely. Using this, the water-based combat mechanics, using that environment. We talked about taking the fight into 3D. Well, taking your adventures underwater, they are literally in 3 dimensions. They can travel, or they can be forced to be moved.
Yes.
And that's even easier because so the water elemental has its water form, and so it can occupy the same space as an adventure. And if you get a grapple on and occupies the same space, you can use that movement speed. You can create a certain threshold where it has to break free. You have to make a strength saving throw to break free of this traveling grapple that it has, something like that. And while you're within that whelmed state, you have to make those constitution saving throws and not to take a minute off your drown.
Water's just funneling into your lungs. You're getting bludgeoned.
And I think that's a beautiful mechanic, and especially in their own kind of home battlefield as well. That's where the water elemental really shines, because you can engage multiple players. Let's say you use that legendary distance whelm. Well, let's say you reverse the mechanic where you've got the paladin at the distance whelm, and then your water elemental is going for the warlock that's off in the distance.
Like he breaks off a whelm as he enveloped the paladin, and then he lets the paladin stay in the whelm, and he goes and attacks those, slightly less armor-clad individuals.
Right, and that really, I love playing paladins, but the biggest challenge as a paladin is movement, because paladins, probably more so than any other class, have very limited effective range, so you spend a lot of the fight just kind of moving around to get to your target. Well, in water, that your efficacy in movement is halved. And maybe you're wearing armor likely as well, so you as the DM can implement more challenges in that. Is in order to swim, in order to resist the grapple, you have to let's say the DC is a little bit higher for someone who's wearing armor because you're so weighed down.
Absolutely.
No, there's so many options that you can implement as a dungeon master to make it more challenging.
And like the thing is, the water elemental's got a 90-foot swim speed. Flex that on your players, and because they're already, unless and this gives your water genasi or your aquan player a nice chance to shine, because their movement speed in water is more than the rest of them, but the rest of them are going to be struggling to keep up if he's constantly catching them in whelms, leaving them behind and attacking somebody else, and dragging everybody in the party apart from each other and using its speed to its own advantage.
Yeah, and I think this is a good opportunity. So the water elemental boss is can be singularly amazing if you juice it correctly. But also, let's say it has some minions. It is the guardian spirit of this lake in the center of this enchanted forest, and it manifests its children. And so while your players are being whelmed, they're getting wailed on by regular water elementals, or you can create your own minor water elementals. That adds that kind of not literally but figuratively pack tactic to your fight.
Yeah, and if you think a normal standard water elemental would be too strong of a combination, you can go to water weirds, who are basically the same thing, just dulled down a little bit.
Yes,
or
absolutely.
If you want, you can use things like mermaids, some merfolk that have pretty low stat blocks, but they can swim and use the water to their advantage.
Yeah, absolutely. There's so many options that you can implement. There's a whole plethora of water-based creatures, adversaries, monsters that never ever get used unless you're in a water-based campaign, which I think is a shame because they really do create a fantastic opportunity to surprise your players.
Yeah.
So
tsunami your players right off of the bridge. Make them make a dex save to avoid the tsunami. One of them is bound to fail if you set the DC properly. And are your players just going to let that person get waylaid in the water? Probably not. They're probably going to dive in after them, or the one or two people who did fail and got yanked in.
Yeah, and that's another thing too, is let's say you do want to, maybe you don't want to jump straight into the fight. We'll use this situation we described earlier. You're crossing a bridge over this wide and dangerous rushing river, and it's dusk. It's hard to see, and suddenly your bard goes missing. You just hear the splash of water, a small yelp, and he's gone. And that's the kind of thing that you can implement with a water elemental, is that they're very fast in their own elements. They're relatively silent, especially if you're in kind of a water situation.
Oh yeah.
And so you can create suspense and shock. You don't have to jump straight into combat, and that's kind of the mobility and the versatility of the water elemental. So I think that would be very fun.
Oh, that'd be excellent. Well,
so if you were to, I'm just so interested. We're talking about situations. If you were to create a lair for this boss, what would you think would be a fun lair? And how would you use it using these things that we've kind of talked about?
Fun. I like the idea that you're on a rocky, those rocky beaches that have a bunch of pools of water that sea urchins and crabs will live in. And as, high and low tide comes, it creates these pools and these rocky beaches, and your players are there hunting after something, or they're looking for something, or maybe they're tracking this elemental itself. And out of these pools, like you said, he can be stalking them in between these pools, and this gives him plenty of opportunities to grab somebody and take them into a completely separate pool than what the main area of water, because each of these things can be completely on their own little space, and they probably have little vents of holes in the rocks that he's able to fit through, but nobody else would be able to fit through because he is the water. And that gives him plenty of spots to create tethers for his spheres that he can create, and people, so it's not all stemming from one source, it's coming from multiple sources that the players can then attack. And perhaps he's even pulling them into slightly bigger pools and singling people out, and he's got his water weird children in those singular pools, and now you're in one-on-one combat with a water weird while the rest of your party is off taking care of the main elemental, and he's using tsunamis to drag people into the actual water behind him. That's kind of where my head was going with all of it. If I were to have the ideal location in my mind.
Very much so. I love the idea of the little pools too, because that adds like a visual randomness. It's a wonderful mechanic that you can implement, and just like the visual of having these pools around you, and you as the DM, well, you can choose any one of them to manifest these legendary actions, and so your players really have to be decisive and specific about where they're standing, and how much threat that's going to pose to them. Are they going to draw focus from the DM, from the water elemental, depending on what situation they put themselves in? So I love that. I think that's so nice.
That's probably how I would end up manifesting it.
Mm-hmm.
What about you?
As far, oh yes, for me, I like the idea, and you can pique an adventurer's interest. Let's say that you were making like, you wanted to make like a 2 or 3 session story out of something. Let's say that they hear about a magical trident or something like that, some kind of magic weapon that sits in the center of this cavernous, icy arena or something like that. And many have ventured out, but no one has returned, so no one knows what is consuming these adventurers who have gone out. And of course, your adventurers are going to go after a magic item and be the promise of adventure and perhaps disaster. So you get there, and there's this kind of spherical arena, great ridges of ice that have come around. And in the center of this crater of ice, you see this golden trident, and it's just sitting there, surrounded by nothing. And then your adventurers go up and they grab the trident. They probably won't be able to use it because you have to attune or something, but as soon as they engage with a magic item, a huge water elemental rises up out of the ice and begins to wreak havoc. And you can use you're surrounded by ice, so you can use all of that. You can change its form, you can change the damage types, things like that. And you can create an icy arena in which your water elemental boss can just wreak havoc.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
I think that would be a lot of fun.
I mean, and if your players, if you have a very creative group, they can even use that dome and terrain to their own advantage. You got that, maybe your wizard wants to set off a fireball up in the roof to drop down a bunch of icicles onto, instead of using it like normal, this could give good incentive to use their environment if you do it appropriately.
Yeah, you even have spells that can do it. You have the cantrip shape water. You've got control water, the spell, which can, it's clerics, druids, things like that. And using those things that normally wouldn't be extremely useful unless you're in a very specific situation, you can use that. And those things that you chose because you thought they would be cool.
Yeah.
Now they are cool. Now you can use them to your advantage.
Absolutely. So. Oh man, I love that. That is a amazing visual.
Yeah, and I think that's the potential of a water elemental is you can create something that's narratively very engaging.
Yes, and elementals are just awesome, and everybody loves the thought of elementals and being. Everybody's watched like Avatar: The Last Airbender. Everybody loves the idea of elementals, and dang it, I want them to be cool, and I want them to be awesome villains. Maybe not your ultimate villain, but I want them to be fun battles, and that's what we're doing here, and that's what we're going to continue to do here. Mick Daggers,
absolutely.
Do you have other thoughts before we close out the water elemental video?
Yeah, my own desires for the elementals. I love them very much. As I said, I recently got to use water elementals quite a bit. They shouldn't just be damage soakers. There's so much potential for storytelling, and you as a DM, you can manipulate the idea of the water elemental almost more than any other stat block.
Absolutely.
Because you can physically manifest whatever you want with it. So I encourage dungeon crafters, I encourage players to really dive into what your vision of this fight, this potential boss could be, and really just be be playful with it and have fun. And
Mhm.
it shouldn't always be, I rush into the elemental and begin to slash. You can create horror, you can create suspense, you can create excitement, all with this kind of creature, and with many other types of creatures as well. That's what this whole series is about.
Mhm.
So that would be my final thought, is be imaginative with the water elemental.
Absolutely. Always remember, the stat blocks are simply suggestions and ideas, and you can do whatever you want with any of them.
Very much so.
Well, I think that is some solid advice and some solid thoughts when it comes to a water elemental boss that you guys can implement. And if you end up with any cool ideas, or if you ran an interesting water elemental, send it to us. We'd love to read it. Put it in the comments. Send it to us on Instagram. Email it to us. Send it anywhere you would like. And because we like to read about it, and we want to know what kind of cool ideas that you guys come up with as well.
Yes, we want to hear your stories. I think that's a motivator for us, probably more so than even us telling what we want to see. So yeah, please send us your stuff. Get into contact with us, no matter how you create, whether it's drawing, writing, voiceover, whatever you do, whatever interests you in storytelling, please share it with us, and we want to share it with everyone else as well.
Absolutely. Well, I think that is a good conclusion to our water elemental boss build.
Bum bum bum.
And I hope all of you guys have a beautiful day. And we'll see you next time.